So, I want to talk tonight about Endgame, the book on the reality, and the way, that book really began from a fundamental question of, do you believe that this culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? And, I've asked that question of thousands of people, and nobody ever says yes. Oh, one guy at one of my talks raised his hand, and everybody looks at him. He said, "Oh, voluntary? No, of course not." And so the next question is, if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living, and you care about the land where you live, what does that mean for your strategy and for your tactics? And the answer is we don't really know. And one of the reasons that we don't know is because we don't really talk about it. And one of the reasons that we don't talk about it is because we're all so busy pretending that we have hope. And I'm going to do some serious hope bashing later. It's one of my favorite things to do. So that's really where I want to, and that's really what the book is about, is if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation, what do you do? And so I think what I would like to do is go through the premises of that book. And one of the things I've done in Endgame is I put my premises in boldface in the front of the book. And one of the reasons I did that is because one of the first rules of propaganda is if you can slide your premises by people, you've got them. About Hitler, it was said, from insane premise to monstrous conclusion, Hitler was coldly isoleological. So he would say, what are we going to do about the Jewish problem? Gosh, Adolf, good question. What are we going to do about it? But see, what he's done is he's slid the premise by you that there's a Jewish problem you have to do something about. Or similarly, you hear some talking head on television say, so how can we make the U.S. economy grow? God, good question. Well, okay, some of the premises. A, we want the U.S. economy to grow. B, we want the U.S. economy to exist. C, who the hell's we? And so, like I said, I didn't want to do that. I don't want to slide premises by people. And so the structure of this talk is going to be that I want to go through some of the premises for that book. And the first premise is that industrial civilization is not, and civilization itself, but especially industrial civilization, is not and can never be sustainable. Civilization is not and can never be sustainable. A few years ago, I was riding in a car with a friend of mine we were stuck in traffic, and I was just making conversation, and I said, so George, if you could live at any level of technology that you wanted, what would it be? And George can sometimes kind of be a curmudgeon, and that day was not in a good mood, and he said, Derrick, that's a really stupid question. We can fantasize whatever we want, but the truth is there's only one level of technology that's sustainable, and that's the Stone Age. And we're going to be there again someday, and the only question really is what's going to be left of the world when we get there. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that any way of living that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. In fact, it takes anybody but a rocket scientist to figure that out. That before we go any further, it's like, okay, that's nice. What's civilization? And, I've been bashing civilization for about 15 years now, and so I figure I'd probably better finally define it. And the definition that I'm using is that civilization is a way of life that's characterized by the growth of cities. And that's defensible both linguistically and historically. Well, that's nice, Derrick, but what's a city? And a city, I've defined as a collection of people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources. And what that means is the Tolowa, on whose land I now live, were not civilized. They didn't require the importation of resources. They didn't live in cities. They lived in villages, camps, and once again, they didn't require the importation of resources. They would eat salmon and clams and huckleberry and salal and salmon and salmon and salmon and salmon, and then usually through the winter they would eat a lot of salmon. And the Tolowa lived there for 12,500 years if you believe the myths of science. And if you believe the myths of the Tolowa, then they lived there since the beginning of time. And this culture has been there for 180 years, 170 years, and the area's getting pretty trashed. And so two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One of them is that your way of living can never be sustainable, because if you require the importation of resources, it means that you've denuded the landscape of that particular resource, and as your city grows, you'll denude an ever larger area. And denuding the landscape of a resource harms the land base. It's very interesting. You know, I know we've all been told that natural selection is based on competition, and that, you know, it's all just a fierce battle for who can be the meanest and grab the most resources most quickly and exploit the most thoroughly. But short of showing how stupid our discourse is, I can disprove that in one sentence if you give me a couple of semicolons. And that's those creatures who've survived in the long run have survived in the long run. Semicolon. You don't survive in the long run by hyper-exploiting your surroundings. Semicolon. You survive in the long run by actually making your habitat better. What a concept. Okay, so anyway, two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One is that you can never be sustainable, which means we could all become the best little natural capitalists in the world, and it doesn't matter. So long as there is this fundamental system in place, it's not going to be sustainable. And the other thing it means is that your way of life must be based on violence, because if you require the importation of resources, trade will never be sufficiently reliable. Because if you require the importation of resources and the people in the next watershed over aren't going to trade you for it, you're going to take it, which means we could all become junior bodhisattvas, and it wouldn't matter. The US military would still have to be huge, because how else are they going to get access to our oil that just happens to be under somebody else's land? If they require that oil, they're going to take it. So those two things are really fundamental. Because I've been talking about resources, so I want to go back to what I was saying before about any way of life. Another way to look at all this is any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources also won't last. I mean, it doesn't matter what resource you're talking about. You would think that if you have a way of life that's based on the use of, I don't know, let's just choose a random example, oil. You would think that you would start to consider what's going to happen when this non-renewable resource runs out. That, once again, just by definition, any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. And I would go a step further, and I would say that any way of life that's based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources won't last. So if every year there are fewer salmon returned than the year before, eventually you're going to run out. And everybody knows this except for Michael Sissenwine, who is in charge of one of the divisions of the National Marine Fisheries Services, and his response when learning that 90% of the large fish in the oceans are gone was to say, that's not a problem. We have to ask what level of decline is reasonable or sustainable. Exactly. And so in basically 2 sentences or 3 sentences, he destroyed the words problem, decline, 2 sentences, he destroyed the words problem, decline, reasonable, and sustainable. So in any case, if every year there are fewer passenger pigeons returned than there were the year before, eventually there will be none. If every year there is fewer old-growth forest, which once wasn't called old-growth forest but was simply called home, then eventually it will be gone. And I'm going to go a step further, and I'm going to say that any way of life that's based on the use of resources won't last. Because a resource is something there to be used. And there's a great line by a Canadian lumberman, when I look at trees, I see dollar bills. And if when I look at trees, I see dollar bills, I'm going to treat them one way. I'm going to convert them into dollar bills. If when I look at trees, I see trees, I'm going to treat them another way. And if when I look at this particular tree, I see this particular tree, I'm going to treat it differently still. And it's the same with fish. If when I look at salmon, I see dollar bills, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at salmon, I see salmon, I'm going to treat them another way. If when I look at this particular fish, I see this particular fish, I'll treat it differently still. The same is true also of women. If when I look at women, I see orifices, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at women, I see women, I'm going to treat them another way. And if when I look at this particular woman, I see this particular woman, I'm going to treat her differently still. If you perceive another as a resource, you're going to use them as opposed to enter into a relationship with them. And I need to be really clear that just because I perceive a fish as a fish, that doesn't mean that I can't eat it. And I was doing a radio interview in Spokane, Washington several years ago, and the interviewer said, you know, Indians exploited salmon too. And I said, no, they didn't, they ate them. And he said, what's the difference? I said, well, they gave them respect for the spirit in exchange for the flesh. And I knew that that answer was kind of bullshit, but I'm a male, and so I'm required by law to answer every question that's asked of me. And so that afternoon, I went out and I sat next to this tree that I had a long relationship with, and I asked the tree, what is the fundamental predator-prey relationship? And the tree gave me the answer right away, which is, if you consume the flesh of another, you now take responsibility for the continuation of the other's community. So if I consume the flesh of salmon from the Klamath River, I now take responsibility for the continuation of the Klamath River salmon. And that's, everybody knows this. You know, bears know it, mergansers know it, newts know it. The mergansers know that if you consume all the newts in this pond, there won't be any newts in the pond anymore. And we just forget sometimes. And that's the fundamental predator-prey bargain that we have to get into. And I want to say something else about that, and then we'll come back to the other. But I got into a big argument with this guy several years ago because he was saying that because I use toilet paper that I am just as culpable for deforestation as the CEO of Weyerhaeuser. And I knew that that was wrong, but I couldn't really articulate why. And he said, go ask a tree. A tree will tell you. So I went out and asked a tree, and the tree said, you're an animal. You consume things. Get over it. But then it also gave me the other answer, which is, yes, I am culpable, not because I consume the flesh of a tree. I'm culpable because I consume the flesh of a tree without fulfilling my end of the bargain. I'm culpable not because I use toilet paper, but because I don't stop Weyerhaeuser from deforesting. And that's a much more serious culpability than simply consuming. So I'm not culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon. I'm culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon and I don't take out the fucking Iron Gate. Thanks.